body is relaxed, the lungs fill with gas. There's no poison, no gunshots, no needles, just air. Or at least it seems that way. A barely audible whisper, yet loaded with the weight of death. It was January 2024, and the winter chill in Alabama wasn't as penetrating as the oppressive stillness inside the walls of Holman Correctional Facility. Kenneth Smith, a name that would soon resonate in headlines around the world, became the first human being to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia. His death wasn't just silent, it was historic, a grim milestone in the evolution of capital punishment in the United States. And what happened that night, inside an execution chamber designed to be forgotten, could forever redefine how a nation confronts its most extreme form of justice. But what exactly is nitrogen hypoxia? Is it, as its proponents claim, a more humane way to die? A painless farewell, wrapped in the invisibility of a colorless, odorless gas? Or is it, on the contrary, a sophisticated mask for invisible suffering, a veiled agony that science and the law are only beginning to comprehend? Today, we're diving deep into the depths of this method. We'll tell you the genesis of its emergence, explore real-life cases that have tested its promises, break down the medical and ethical controversies surrounding it, and analyze the legal battles that have attempted, often in vain, to stop its advance. It's an execution method that promises to be painless, a quick and peaceful end. But the harsh truth is that none of those who have experienced it, has survived to confirm it. The recent history of the death penalty in the United States is marked by a quiet yet devastating crisis. A chronic shortage of the lethal drugs traditionally used in executions by injection. It was a problem brewing since the early 2000s, when an increasing number of European and later American pharmaceutical companies began to categorically refuse to sell their compounds for execution purposes. Their reasons were varied: ethical objections, activist pressure, or simply the desire to not associate their products with state-administered death. The result of this widespread refusal? A legal puzzle for states, forced to desperately search for alternatives. The old prison pharmacies ran dry, and execution protocols became unsustainable. It was in this context of urgency and legal experimentation that a nearly untested proposal emerged, a method cloaked in the apparent simplicity of basic chemistry: nitrogen hypoxia. The idea of oxygen-free air to induce death began to float through legislative halls. In its purest conception, nitrogen hypoxia is disarmingly simple. It consists of placing an airtight mask on the condemned, similar to those used for breathing, and instead of vital air, pure nitrogen is pumped in. This gas, colorless, odorless, and non-toxic by itself, acts as a substitute, displacing the oxygen from the lungs and, by extension, from the bloodstream. The human body, deprived of its essential fuel, then enters a state of deep hypoxia, a silent suffocation at the cellular level. It's an internal collapse, a gradual yet relentless disconnection of vital systems, culminating in loss of consciousness, involuntary convulsions, and finally, death. It's a programmed shutdown where the switch is the absence of life itself. Fictitious excerpt. Simulated interview with Dr. James Kovac, clinical forensic pathologist. From a medical standpoint, death by hypoxia can be surprisingly fast. The brain is incredibly sensitive to lack of oxygen, but that doesn't mean it's pleasant. In fact, that's one of the great fallacies. The brain doesn't care if you're breathing something. What it cares about is oxygen. And if it doesn't get it, it starts shutting down desperately, sending alarm signals throughout the body. It's not a nap, it's a collapse. The idea, initially seen as an elegant solution to the drug crisis, was fervently pushed by states like Alabama, Mississippi, and Oklahoma, which legalized the method between 2015 and 2018. However, despite its approval in the books, nearly 10 years passed before anyone dared to cross that threshold. Theory was one thing, practice, a very different one. The first to face the judgment of nitrogen was Kenneth Eugene Smith, a man whose name was already etched in the annals of capital punishment for a very different reason. Kenneth Smith was convicted in 1988 for a crime that shook Alabama's foundations and left a deep scar on the community: the brutal contract killing of Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett. This act was carried out with an accomplice, a dark pact that led him to face the ultimate penalty: For more than 35 long years, Smith lived on death row, an existential purgatory where hours stretched into eternity and days turned into decades of appeals and false hopes. In that liminal space, time didn't pass linearly. It stretched and contracted capriciously, a silent torment of constant uncertainty. However, his name wasn't just recorded in history for his sentence. It was a failed and agonizing execution attempt that catapulted him to national infamy, transforming him unwillingly into the high-profile and involuntary candidate for a deadly experiment that would change the landscape of capital punishment. In 2022, his execution date by lethal injection finally arrived, a day marked on the calendar to end decades of waiting. However, what was expected to be a grim yet swift procedure came to an abrupt halt midway. The officials in charge, in a desperate attempt that stretched into endless hours, turning into a visible nightmare for those present, failed to find a viable vein on Kenneth Smith. It was an ordeal of repeated punctures and palpable frustration, a technical failure manifested as prolonged agony. This failed attempt was quickly labeled as true torture, a humanitarian fiasco that transcended the prison walls. The case quickly escalated, becoming a national scandal that reignited with unusual intensity the already polarized debate on the inherent cruelty of capital punishment and the methods used to carry it out. The image of Smith, subjected to a needle-laden ordeal, was etched into the public consciousness. Fictitious excerpts simulating a defense attorney. What they did to Kenneth Smith that night was an act of unnecessary cruelty, a fundamental violation of his dignity. They tortured him with needles for more than an hour, unsuccessfully searching for a vein that would allow them to carry out their macabre mandate. They returned him to his cell with a bruised body, his eyes blank from the trauma. That wasn't justice, it was torture. And the mere fact that it was considered a failure instead of a crime says a lot about how society approaches these limits. It was precisely after this failed attempt that Alabama, desperate to find a way to execute its condemned, approved nitrogen hypoxia. And with a blood-chilling cynicism, Smith was first on the list. The execution was recorded internally, a record for the archives, but not broadcast to the public. Transparency was sacrificed on the altar of efficiency. On January 25, 2024, Kenneth Eugene Smith was killed in Alabama in the state's first authorized nitrogen gas execution. The scene, according to reports, was chilling in its brutal simplicity. He was strapped to a gurney, connected to a pulse oximeter, ECG pads, and a full-face air respirator. The staging of a modern death. Nitrogen gas was promoted as a humane and peaceful execution method, a technique that would put people to sleep in seconds, followed by a quick and quiet death. However, reality dealt a brutal blow to that narrative. According to witnesses, the scene was far from peaceful. Smith writhed and convulsed for minutes, thrashing violently on the gurney as his body appeared to struggle to breathe. He was declared dead after 28 minutes. Eyewitnesses, accredited press, described that he violently shook his body for several minutes. Some, using perhaps more conciliatory language, described it as a serene death. Others, with heartbreaking honesty, as a silent agony. The truth, as almost always, lies in the nuance, and the perception of that agony was etched in the minds of those who witnessed it. Smith's execution exposes the unsettling entanglement between medicine and capital punishment and calls for a renewed examination of whether health professionals should participate in these acts. Smith's death revealed a deep crack in the logic supporting the new method. With no solid scientific evidence to support the theory of a painless death, the states had adopted a method never before used anywhere in the world. In 2015, Oklahoma, another state facing the lethal drug crisis after the botched execution of Clayton Lockett in 2014, became the first state to adopt a measure allowing prison personnel to use nitrogen gas to execute individuals. That failed execution of Lockett, where the inmate convulsed and agonized for more than 40 minutes, had caused a temporary halt to executions in the state, and the desperation to find a solution led them to nitrogen. Before Kenneth Smith's execution in Alabama in 2024, no execution had ever been carried out anywhere in the world using inert gas suffocation like nitrogen. Despite this total absence of scientific evidence and precedent, Mississippi passed a similar law in 2017, and on March 22, 2018, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey signed legislation making Alabama the third state in the country to allow executions by nitrogen gas. More recently, in March 2024, Louisiana joined this controversial list, adding nitrogen asphyxiation to its capital punishment arsenal. The trend was clear. The desperation to carry out executions outweighed any scientific or ethical precaution. In theory, nitrogen presents itself as the perfect, undetectable killer. It is a gas without smell, color, or taste, the most abundant component of the atmosphere we breathe every day, making it familiar and seemingly harmless. That's why breathing it in an oxygen-deprived environment seems completely normal to the human body, an act as natural as any routine inhalation. However, this apparent normality is a deadly trap, a deceptive facade wrapped in the very appearance of life. But normality is only a momentary illusion, because when oxygen disappears, the essential fuel, so too vanishes the very foundation of consciousness and, ultimately, existence. It's a silent goodbye, almost imperceptible, where the air that should sustain life becomes the very vector of death. The human body in this situation begins to react in chilling fashion within seconds. 15 seconds. A mild euphoria, perhaps slight blurry vision, the brain struggling to interpret the absence of oxygen as an oddity rather than an imminent threat. 30 seconds. Loss of motor coordination. Movements become clumsy. The body begins to disconnect from the mind. 60 seconds. Unconsciousness. An abrupt shutdown that proponents of the method cite as proof of its humaneness. But this unconsciousness is not sleep. It is the beginning of irreversible neuronal collapse. 90 to 120 seconds. Neuronal collapse deepens. Brain damage becomes massive and permanent. 180 seconds. Brain death, the end of all neurological activity, the point of no return. Fictitious excerpt. Recreated interview with Dr. Mariana Ruiz, forensic neuropsychology specialist. What truly worries me about nitrogen hypoxia isn't just the speed at which apparent unconsciousness occurs, but the absence of clear signs of suffering for outside observers. The condemned may appear calm, may even be motionless, but inside, the brain could be experiencing a kind of internal suffocation, sending distress signals that don't manifest in external movements. It's as if the brain is screaming silently, a voiceless, gestureless agony, which makes us question whether we are truly being more humane or simply more effective at hiding the horror. Unlike other execution methods that often involve explicit scenes of violence or pain, here there is no blood to stain the scene, nor are there needles piercing skin, a relief for those who abhor the sight of medical instruments used to take life. What remains is only absolute silence, a deep and disturbing stillness that for critics and ethics experts could be hiding an invisible and appalling suffering. This silence is not necessarily peace. It may be the veil of inaudible torture, wrapped in the deceptive cloak of humanity. It is promoted as a clean death, an end without visual mess. But the crucial question persists. Is this apparent cleanliness a sign of a more ethical process, or merely a way to make brutality easier to digest for those who observe or justify it? While the chilling echo of Kenneth Smith's execution still resonated through prison corridors and public debate, another name emerged, dark and looming on the horizon of capital punishment, that of Jesse James Hoffman. Convicted for the brutal murder of a student in 1996, a crime that profoundly shocked his community, Hoffman found himself in 2025 scheduled for a singular fate. He would become one of the first individuals in Louisiana to face death by nitrogen hypoxia, a method as new as it is controversial. What makes his case even more symbolic and historically charged is that Louisiana had not executed anyone in over 15 years. The reintroduction of capital punishment in the state, and with such a novel and polemical method, placed Hoffman at the center of a legal and ethical storm. Fictitious excerpt. Simulated testimony of a correctional officer from Angola prison. I never thought we'd execute again, and definitely not like this. I've seen the injection. I've been near the electric chair. This isn't like that. This is different. Cleaner, sure. No fluids, no visible drama. But there's something colder too. a distance. It's like the process has become so technical that it's impersonal, and that sometimes is more disturbing than the mess. Hoffman's defense, as expected, and in a final desperate attempt to save his life, tried to halt the judicial process. His lawyers, appealing to constitutional conscience, vigorously argued that nitrogen hypoxia was not merely an unusual method, but a cruel and unusual punishment, a flagrant violation of the principles enshrined in the Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution. They argued that the suffering Smith had experienced was clear evidence of the inhumanity of the process. However, the Louisiana State Supreme Court, invoking state sovereignty and the pressing need to carry out justice in the name of victims, endorsed the use of the gas. This decision not only sealed Hoffman's fate, but also flung the doors wide open to future executions by this method in Louisiana. And even more significantly, it established a dangerous precedent for other states seeking alternatives to traditional methods. The machinery of capital punishment, relentless and adaptable, had found in the lethal stillness of nitrogen a new and controversial tool to fulfill its purpose. Nitrogen hypoxia has been presented as the humane solution to the problems of lethal injection, a way to avoid failed executions and images of suffering. But this narrative is far from free of criticism, and the voices rising against it are powerful and diverse. Amnesty International, one of the world's leading human rights organizations, bluntly labeled it a disguised medical experiment, denouncing the lack of scientific rigor and the experimental nature of the method. In fact, medical associations in the United States, with a clear ethical commitment, flatly refused to participate in designing the nitrogen execution protocol, arguing that their mission is to save lives, not take them. The deepest concern, and perhaps the most unapproachable, is that no complete and ethically valid scientific studies exist on how nitrogen asphyxiation affects conscious people, and even less so individuals subjected to the extreme levels of stress involved in an execution. Theory says one thing, human experience is another. Fictitious excerpt from a criminologist who participated in the investigation. The temptation to clean up the execution, to make it invisible, is understandable from a societal perspective. No one wants to witness horror. But are we normalizing an execution without visible signs of suffering? We are creating a distance, a kind of veil between the act of killing and public awareness. Perhaps that isn't more compassionate. Perhaps, just perhaps, it's more cowardly, an attempt to evade our own moral responsibility by making state-administered death sterile and invisible. Nitrogen hypoxia, in its ambiguous and controversial nature, firmly inhabits a gray area of criminal justice, a murky terrain where science, ethics, and law collide. Diverging state decisions, the absence of a unified federal consensus, and the lack of solid precedents only further fragment the application of law, creating a mosaic of disparate approaches across the country. Each state that chooses to adopt this method is not only desperately seeking a functional solution to carry out death sentences, it becomes, whether it wants to or not, a true moral laboratory. In this experiment of unheard-of proportions, human life and dignity are reduced to variables, hanging precariously by a thread, while society watches, often with a mix of fascination and revulsion. This dilemma is not merely legal or scientific. It drags us to the very core of our existence, to life's most basic and irrefutable function: breathing. Breathing is the most fundamental act of life, the first sign of our existence, and the last breath that escapes when we die. It is the invisible rhythm that intrinsically connects us to the outside world, the silent fuel that powers every thought, every movement, every emotion we experience. Yet in a sealed chamber, designed for isolation, where the air no longer contains oxygen, the very essence of this act twists into a macabre paradox. There, each inhalation is not a sip of life, but an irreversible step toward the abyss, a relentless countdown. Breathing then becomes the last thing you'll do, a cruel irony where the breath of life transforms, in a final sigh, into the herald of death. Nitrogen hypoxia is a grim invention of the 21st century, born of necessity and controversy. It could define how the condemned die in the United States in the decades to come, becoming the standard. Or conversely, its controversial nature and lack of convincing evidence regarding its humanity could lead to its eventual disuse. Time will tell. Perhaps the real question posed by this method is not whether it's more humane. That's the easy question, the one that seeks a technical justification. The real question, the one that confronts us as a society, is much deeper and more painful. Do we remain human by using it? Or does the act of seeking a clean and silent way to take a life dehumanize us in the process, by avoiding facing the inherent brutality of capital punishment? In a world that demands transparency, where every process and every judicial decision is subjected to increasingly intense public scrutiny, an uncomfortable question arises when speaking about the death penalty. Is a silent, hidden death, wrapped in the invisibility of a gas, truly preferable just because it spares us from facing what we're actually doing in the name of society? Does it make us more humane, or simply more comfortable? Or on the contrary, is it precisely that concealment, that veil of silence and cleanliness, that distances us from our own humanity, diluting our ability to confront the true nature of the death penalty? The answer to that question, beyond technique or science, lies in the reflection of what we are as a society and what we are willing to tolerate in our name. Do you believe that a clean method of execution makes us more civilized, or simply distances us from the harsh reality of what it means to take a life? Leave your comment below and join the conversation. Your perspective is crucial in this debate.